Thank you very much, Mr. Jorash Podorski, Your Excellency, the Vice President of the Human Rights Council, for inviting me to speak before this 45th session of the Human Rights Council. Your Excellencies, members of the Human Rights Council, representative of Indigenous peoples, national human rights institutions, NGOs, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Victoria Tauli-Corpuz. I am a Kankanai Igorot from the Cordillera region in the Philippines, and I was the previous special rapporteur on the rights of indigenous peoples. I am presenting to you today my assessment of the trends of violence and threats against indigenous peoples, the root causes of this phenomena, actions that need to be taken by states and other actors to prevent criminalization, violence, and threats against indigenous peoples' rights defenders. When I made my report on criminalization in indigenous peoples in 2018, I expressed my serious concern over the rising numbers of indigenous peoples being killed extrajudicially and criminalized, and I made recommendations on how to address these problems. So I will refer to this report as I speak. But recently, I also read through the reports of the Global Witness, which they presented in July 2020, and this looked at the situation of climate crisis and the threats and violence against environment and land rights defenders. I also looked at the report of the Indigenous Peoples' Rights International, a new organization of indigenous peoples, which did some monitoring between January to July of this year. The Global Witness report says that in 2019, there were 212 reported cases of murders of human rights defenders. On the average, 4 defenders have been killed every week. And out of these 212, 40% belong to indigenous communities. This means that there are already 84 indigenous activists killed in 2019. And over half of these killed are found in the Philippines and in Colombia. Colombia having the highest, 64 persons killed and murdered, and Philippines had 43. 2/3 of all the killings took place in Latin America. This report also identified the key sectors which were linked with the killings, and the mining industry was linked with 50 defenders killed, and the agribusiness sector was linked to 34 murders. The Indigenous Peoples' Rights International had also looked at the situation of criminalization and extrajudicial killings, and their findings showed that for the first 7 months of 2020, there are 101 indigenous rights defenders who were murdered, and this data came from only 23 countries. Colombia, again, has the highest number of murders, which is 60 indigenous human rights defenders. There are also reports on how many indigenous peoples have been arrested and criminalized, and in the report that they made, they said there were 300 individuals who suffered from such kinds of violations, and 24 communities were also threatened, and many of them have been displaced from their territories. These trends are serious and very grave, and more action is needed from the side of governments, the private sector, and other actors to stop and prevent this from even worsening further. The key reason for this situation is the intensification of competition over the extraction of natural resources, which are led by private corporations and sometimes with the complicity of governments. My 2018 report has further identified some root causes, and the key underlying cause of of intensified attacks against the indigenous peoples is the lack of respect for indigenous peoples' collective land rights and the failure to provide indigenous peoples with secure land tenure. The escalations of attacks versus indigenous peoples is occurring in the context of skewed power structures whereby private companies wield significant influence over states, which ensure that regulatory policies and investment agreements are tailored to promote profitability of the business enterprises. In relation to how to address these root causes as well as how to empower indigenous peoples to be able to protect and assert their rights, I have also made a few recommendations in my report, which I would like to share with you now. First of all, the government has to undertake impartial and prompt investigation measures to provide effective redress and reparations to the victims of criminalization and extrajudicial killings. Secondly, there should be a zero tolerance approach to killings and violence versus indigenous people's human rights defenders. Thirdly, legislations which create due diligence obligations for companies registered in their jurisdiction should be put in place. Fourthly, comprehensive review of national legislations to ensure due process and the revocation of laws and criminal procedures that violate the principle of legality and contradict international human rights obligations of states should also be done. Fifth, laws and policies which expressly support the protection of human rights defenders should be in place as well, and the recognition of collective land rights. There should be a training of law enforcement officials and prosecutors on human rights standards, and these officials should refrain from criminalizing indigenous peoples. And finally, for states to ensure that the right of indigenous peoples to consultation and free prior informed consent are also protected and respected. For the private sector, I stated that human rights due diligence in all operations should be instilled, and human rights impact assessments should be done. And I call on the private sector to stop acts of defamation of indigenous peoples which lead to stigmatization. I also have some recommendations for the donors, which is calling on them to require human rights impact assessment and to ensure that specific protection for indigenous peoples and their effective participation will be ensured when in the projects that they are supporting. So these are just some of the recommendations, and I look forward to discussions after this wherein we can elaborate further and enrich the steps that need to be taken. Finally, I would just like to say that in light of these situations, there should be more constructive dialogues between indigenous peoples and the states, as well as the private sector, at all levels, from the local up to the national, up to the global levels. If the private sector, for instance, is involved, there should also be processes which they will install that will allow for that kind of dialogue to take place. Thank you very much.